I'm Dave Cook from the Christian Science Monitor. Our guest today is Representative Michael McCaul, Chairman of the House Homeland Security Committee. This is his first visit with one of our little meetings here, and we appreciate his coming very much. Our guest is a Dallas native who earned his degrees in San Antonio, a bachelor's degree at Trinity University, and his law degree at St. Mary's University. He worked as a federal prosecutor from 1990 to 1999, and then moved to Austin to become a deputy to then Texas Attorney General John Cornyn. Later, our guest joined the U.S. Attorney's Office and was chief of the Terrorism and National Security Division for West Texas. In 2004, he was elected to the House and became chairman of the House Homeland Security Committee in 2013. He and his wife, Linda, are the parents of 5 children. And thus endeth the biographical portion of the program. Now on to the riveting mechanical details. First, thanks to our underwriter, Northrop Grumman. As always, we're on the record here. Please no live blogging or tweeting. In short, no filing of any kind while the breakfast is underway to give us time to actually listen to what our guest says. There's no embargo when the session ends. To help you curb that relentless selfie urge, we'll email several pictures of the session to all the reporters here as soon as the breakfast ends. As regular attendees know, if you'd like to ask a question, please do the traditional thing and send me a subtle, non-threatening signal, and I'll happily call on as many reporters as we can in the time we have this morning with the chairman. We're going to start off by offering our guests the opportunity to make some opening comments, and then we'll move to questions from around the table. With that, sir, thanks for doing this and for braving the rain. We appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you.
You want
You want me to start off?
Yeah, you can, or
sure,
I can just
I am.
rattle off questions, either way.
Thanks to you and the monitor for hosting this. I just got back from the Middle East and Europe, and we all came back with a strange, mysterious cough. Cold. I hope it's not MERS disease, or I hope it's not contagious from the press standpoint, but I think we'll be okay. One thing that David mentioned, I have 5 teenagers at home. I'll never forget when I first got elected chairman, I met with Giuliani, and all those guys in New York let them know that, I know that I'm from Texas, but New York's the #1 target, and they asked me about my kids, and they said, teenagers, we've had a couple of those. The difference between a teenager and a terrorist, you can negotiate with a terrorist. So I come to Washington for a little peace and quiet sometimes. But it's a good training experience on both the home front at home, but also in Washington. I'm not going to talk long because I know there's a lot of dialogue, but I think the threat environment has never been more intense since 9/11, both from foreign fighters that we investigated going over to the Middle East and into Europe, where these fighters go to, but also over the internet. You all read about the imminent threat to military installations. Much of that is internet-driven by individuals in Syria and elsewhere, through Twitter accounts to activate followers in the United States. And so that kind of dual threat, along with Syrian refugees, is a serious concern of ours, protecting the homeland. And then, of course, finally, the complete disaster in Iraq. I just met with the Prime Minister of Iraq last week before Ramadi fell, and the idea that we're bringing Shia militias in to fight this war against ISIS is really goes against the grain of everything we've tried to do over there. It inflames the Sunni tribes. It inflames sectarianism. And I don't see how you can politically unify the country with that kind of military strategy. And so I think we're failing there. We're losing ground. And I think Ramadi is a good example of that. And I often tell people back home and say, Brenham, Texas, why is this so important? It's because if it's a safe haven, a failed state, it's a base of operation from which they can breed terrorism and then conduct external operations against the United States. And so that's why it is so important, not to mention the fact that so many of my constituents have lost their sons and their daughters in the conflict, the Gold Star mothers. They wanted it to count for something. And I think the precipitous withdrawal and the lack of a status of forces agreement, along with Maliki's political malfeasance, created ISIS and led to the resurgence of AQI, which is now modern-day ISIS. And so with that, I always keep it succinct, but I throw that out as an opening sort of salvo for a good discussion. I look forward to it.
Sounds good. I'm going to do one or two. Then we're going to go to Martin Matashak, Brian Bennett, Kate Nocera, Todd Gilman, Damian Pauletta, Paul Bedard, and Aaron Kelly to start. I want to ask you how consequential you think it will be to Homeland Security if the NSA's bulk data collection program expires, maybe for a brief time, during the congressional recess. You said yesterday, I saw you quote an AP as saying that it's a dangerous thing to do. Why is it dangerous, and aren't there workarounds, at least in the short term?
Well, that's our hope is, but without congressional action, it expires and we go dark, and that creates a danger to the American people. So I'm a little disappointed our leadership on the House and Senate side couldn't work this out in advance. I think we passed a bill out of the House that threaded the needle pretty well between security and privacy that works. When I was a counterterrorism prosecutor applying for FISA warrants with the FBI, we went through the private phone carriers. It can be done. Is metadata probably more accessible and longer retention? Yes. But I think it can be done the way we used to do it and still be effective. And I think just the political reality is I don't think we could pass bulk collection metadata. And I think what you're seeing in the Senate now is a filibuster, which was very predictable, which is now going to tie up the legislation. I think the better approach would have been to pass what we passed out of the House.
One other from me, and that's on Ramadi. Obviously disconcerting, and you talked earlier about the disaster, complete disaster in Iraq. From Homeland Security purposes, why does it matter if Ramadi falls?
Because
why does it matter that Ramadi fell is the way I should have said it?
Well, with Bin Laden, it was caves and couriers. He didn't govern territory. What we're seeing with ISIS is a phenomenon of not only governance, but the way they communicate is very sophisticated over the internet. The more of a stronghold they have, the more power vacuums we have, more failed states, which is what Iraq is becoming. We left Iraq, I think we won. And we left it a secure nation, but the President's decision to not negotiate a status of forces agreement, coupled with Maliki's disenfranchising of the Sunni tribes, created ISIS. And that is a threat to the homeland, because people would say Bin Laden wasn't a threat prior to 9/11, and then we got hit in the World Trade Center. The same phenomenon is true there. It's not just Syria and Iraq, it's also Northern Africa. It's Libya. It's all throughout Northern Africa. It's going into Asia as well. Everywhere we see power vacuums, and this is why most counterterrorism officials will tell you the threat is the greatest they've seen in quite some time, because of the fact that they have more safe havens to operate out of. And when they have that, then they also have better opportunities to conduct external operations, not unlike the Khorasan group in Syria that we know is still intent on developing non-metallic IED explosives to get on airplanes to blow up airplanes over the United States. And don't think for a minute they're not still trying to do that. Now, I think we took out Dredgen, the Frenchman, with an airstrike. Those are good. I think the Abu Sayyaf's demise was positive development. We need more of that. We need to embed our special forces with the Iraqi National Army. But the problem is the Iraqi National Army is not the army that we had 4 years ago. They're not the ones we trained. They're a brand new army that have demonstrated they're completely incapable of defending Iraq. They dropped their weapons in Mosul. They dropped them in Ramadi. And now, sadly, for those of us who appreciate art and antiquities, they've taken over another city with the greatest antiquities in Iraq that they will destroy and sell in the open market for money. I think the CFO's, Abu Sayyaf's, important because he is the CFO of ISIS and controlled the oil and energy supply routes, smuggling routes. The data we got from him, I hope will be helpful to expose their networks both from a terrorism financing standpoint, but also networks inside Syria and outside that we can exploit.
And you feel better about the Abu Sayyaf than we had Adam Schiff here earlier in the week, and he was saying, kudos to our special forces, but concerns about whether it was worth the risk, especially the risk of it had failed. That's not a view you share, I take it.
No, I mean, I respect Adam a lot, and he's a good friend, but I think, just like the takedown of bin Laden, that was worthwhile. I think if we can take down a ISIS leader like Abu, critically important. If we can take out their leadership, now the argument is they'll replace him with somebody, but you're taking out a lot of expertise. Abu Sayyaf had a lot of expertise. Of course, his wife was involved with the enslavement of women, the hostages. Some argue Kayla Mueller may have been a part of this hostage situation. I argue anytime we can take out evil, and particularly those at the top of the chain, and take out their expertise, that's a worthwhile endeavor. And I think we need to do more of that to defeat ISIS. Otherwise, we may as well just wash our hands and walk away from the situation. But we do so at our own peril to the United States.
We're going to go to Martin first from the Hill, over there.
Mr. Chairman, good morning. You mentioned this in your talk about Syrian refugees. Earlier this year at a hearing, you expressed concern about the State Department DHS effort, saying it was possibly creating a federally funded jihadi pipeline into the U.S. So I'm wondering if you could give an update of sorts. Have you talked more to the administration? Have your concerns about the effort been satisfied, allayed? Are you no longer worried about it? Or are you even more concerned?
No, as I came back on our trip from the Middle East, but also Europe, we met with our European counterparts. They're absorbing thousands of Syrian refugees on a monthly basis going into, whether it's Italy, going up north through Germany to Amsterdam. Europe is absorbing these refugees on a daily basis. The assimilation, I don't know how you can assimilate that number. They usually go to the diaspora communities, more the Salafists, more radicalized. The Muslim community is very isolated in Europe from the rest of it. They're not integrated with the European society, and it's a threat to Europe, and they know that. And I'll get into the foreign travel out of Istanbul airport into Europe, how they don't screen their own citizens past the watch list, which is a huge vulnerability with the Europeans. And the Istanbul airport does not screen outbound at all. They screen inbound very well now, but not inbound. They didn't screen at all a year ago because they wanted to fight Assad going through Turkey. After I met with them and after ISIS took 20 of their diplomats, then they've changed their course of action. But the question that you're posing is bringing Syrian refugees into the United States. How safe is that proposition? If it's if it's just mothers and children, I've been over to these camps, by the way, so I've seen what it looks like. And there are a lot of mothers and kids, but there are a lot of males of the age that could, conduct terrorist operations, and that concerns me. The problem I have is that Michael Steinbach, who's the assistant director of the FBI, testified before my committee that we have no way, we don't have databases on these individuals, so we can't properly vet them past databases to know who they are, to know where they came from, to know what threat they pose, because we don't have the data to cross-reference them. And the FBI has warned strongly against this move, as has Homeland Security privately. And I think what you're seeing in the administration is a split between the State Department, which is John Kerry, and Homeland Security and FBI, on the other hand, saying this is a really bad idea from a security standpoint. We even had 2 Iraqis we brought. With all the intelligence we had in Iraq, we had 2 guys that came in that were making bombs in Iraq to kill our guys that were a threat to the United States when they came in. In Syria, since we don't have any intelligence footprint or capability, we have no way to know who these people are. And so I think bringing them in is a serious mistake. We brought in 700 of them already. We're slated to bring in 1,000 more by the end of the year, and the number's going to tick up, over the next 2 years. So I'm not aware of many communities in the United States that want to welcome this. I'm not trying to be an alarmist about it, but I don't want to bring in potential terrorists under, like I said, a federal program.
We're going to go to, you want to do a quick follow, and then we'll go to Brian.
So should the effort be scrapped then?
Well, unless I have assurance that we have databases to properly vet these people. I mean, when I questioned Kerry on Foreign Affairs, he said that there's a super vetting process, but then when I asked the FBI, what is the super vetting process, they said there isn't any. There is none. Because we don't have the databases on them. And so until we have the biometrics and databases to assure us that we can safely bring them in, I don't think that's what the American people want. And I think Europe has a real problem on their hands right now.
Brian Bennett from the LA Times.
I'm going to go back to the expiring provisions of the Patriot Act. Two of the provisions that are going to expire on June 1st haven't gotten that much attention, unlike the bulk data collection provisions, the lone wolf provision and also the roving wiretap provision. In addition, the other business records that the FBI and other intelligence agencies collect under the FBI collects under 215. Those are also set to expire. Can you talk about the impact if those are allowed to expire and the Senate doesn't act?
Yeah, those are probably the two most significant provisions that were passed after 9/11. I think I'm maybe the only, if not a few members that actually prosecuted and practiced under the Patriot Act. So the lone wolf provision gave us great flexibility. The roving wiretap was absolutely essential because, as we're seeing now with these Twitter accounts where they will drop their Twitter account and open up a new one, same thing with the phones. They would just drop disposable and get a new one. So the roving wiretap targets the individual, not the actual communication device. I asked a question, can we apply that now to the more imminent threat now we're seeing coming out of Syria over Twitter accounts in terms of if they drop a Twitter account, can we still keep our coverage up on the individual? Now, part of the problem is identifying that when they open up a new Twitter account, identifying it's the same individual. I would argue the roving wiretap would apply to that scenario, but there is a gap in time where you have to identify it's the same person. And if I could expand, I think one of the greatest concerns we have is what's called going dark. And this is a phenomenon. What they do is, they're very smart. What they will do is they will communicate. They have followers and followings. The followings are the people that they're pinging. That's the ones that they're in constant communication with, trying to radicalize, trying to convert, attack military installations, etc. They'll say, let's go to DM. That means let's go into the message box. When they go into the message box, unless we have coverage, we lose that communication. But even if we do have coverage, like say by FISA or otherwise, then they can go into other platforms that are very temporary platforms that go up, that what we call going dark. Once they go outside that box into other platforms, even if they're up on our coverage, we cannot get the content of that communication anymore. And it's one of the most serious concerns within the IC and CT community is that they have the ability now to communicate what we call secure comm in dark space without our ability to cover and monitor those communications. That may take legislation to fix, and there's some controversy to it all, but a lot would argue, and I talked to Jay Johnson just the other day, it's one of his biggest concerns. And it's one of the Comey's biggest concerns is we can't track the communications of these individuals who are radicalizing individuals in the United States. A foreign fighter is one thing, traveling across the ocean through airports and airplanes and all that, but if you got somebody that you can activate in the United States over the internet, and that's what we call terrorism gone viral. And it's very hard to stop it.
Kate Nocera from BuzzFeed.
You mentioned that Republican leaders in the Senate and the House for this recess. The House is leaving
Just
today.
be a little louder for the hearing impaired.
Sorry, the House
Thank
is
you.
leaving today. Is there any scenario in which a short-term extension could be approved by UC, or is leadership said no to that? And sort of what's the consequence if even a short-term
Yeah, and look, I can't speak for the Senate leadership. And we did our business. I thought we did it right, and we warned that this could happen, and it is happening now. And you have a filibuster now on this, and but I think the worst thing Congress could do is play politics and let this thing expire. That to go dark in our national security or play politics with it is the most dangerous thing we could do. And I think it would be highly irresponsible. So, what are the alternatives? I guess you got that window, I think, between the time we come back and, June 1st. And so it very well may be a UC on the floor while everybody's out of town to at least, extend it. But I don't know what the impact of this filibuster is going to have either. I mean, the easiest thing to do is just pass what we passed. And the president would sign it. And that's the thing. I don't know if what McConnell's doing, I'm not, the White House could very well veto that. So, to me, from a governance standpoint, the best thing to do is pass what the House did in the Senate and send it to the White House. And yeah, it's not perfect, but it will continue to protect Americans. And right now, it's a little, I hate it when we send messages to the terrorists that we're going to be vulnerable.
We're going to go to Todd Gilman from the Dallas Morning News.
I have a couple of questions about the attack in Garland, which I guess is a few crises ago now, the Muslim cartoon event attack. So we've had kind of conflicting reports about whether there was a breakdown of communication between the FBI and local authorities. Can you clarify whether there was a breakdown, whether the threat was conveyed properly? And I'm also wondering, so these guys were ISIS-inspired. Were they, how big a threat do you consider that they were? Were they trained? Were they activated by ISIS? Were they just lone wolf types?
No, the Garland case is a good illustration of what I'm talking about in terms of a network of terrorism over the internet. They were ISIS-inspired over the internet. The guy had a Locky on his Facebook page, right, or his Twitter account, and then had the hashtag Attack Texas. So he was, for a variety of reasons I can't go into, got back on the radar of the FBI. It was noticed that he had left his residence in Phoenix. And given this is where law enforcement actually worked. I mean, they sent a joint intelligence bulletin to JIB, Homeland Security, FBI, about the art cartoon contest a week in advance to all, law enforcement, saying you got to stay on the lookout, because anticipating clearly this kind of activity will provoke a response, right? So when it was noticed that these individuals, these two, but particularly Elton Simpson, was missing, then that information was sent to the Joint Terrorism Task Force in Dallas about him specifically. That information, and I've been critical of the FBI in the Boston bombing and the sharing of information, the JTTF. I will say in this case that information, the FBI did its job, and they properly shared that information with the Garland police. I understand what you're referencing to. If there was any breakdown in a further communication, it would be on the part of the local.
The police chief said we were never informed.
And the Garland police officer on the Joint Terrorism Task Force was advised of Mr. Simpson.
Are there any lessons to be learned from that event, or is that just one of those, as you say, the way the system worked? A lot of people acknowledge that. Are there lessons to be drawn?
Sure, and there always are, but I think on one hand, because the JIB went out in advance, they were all on such high alert that when they came in their van, in a shooting spree, they were automatically taken down by the SWAT team. I mean, they were kind of waiting for them. Now, if there's any breakdown I could analyze from that case, it's that typically the argument is, well, the FBI didn't share information with state and locals. Well, in this case, the FBI did, and it would be an issue of the locals sharing it with their counterparts. And the JTTF model, when it works well, it works very well. And sometimes you have breakdowns, and I wouldn't say it broke down in that case, but if there was any, it was on the part of the locals not sharing it. That Garland police officer on the JTTF should have taken it to his chief.
Is there any reason to think that these guys were activated, ordered to do this, or was it just self-inspired?
Well, it's a matter of semantics. What they're trying to do is activate through calls to arms over the internet. So they identified an art cartoon contest of Muhammad. So they have followers on Twitter and those who are following that they're actively communicating with. And this is a new age of terrorism now, where they will just send out a directive and hope that out of those 1,000 people on their Twitter accounts, they're going to get a couple that will say, you know what, I'll sign up for that.
We're going to go, we're about halfway through. We're going to go next to Damian Paletto of the Journal. And after that, Paul Bedard, Aaron Kelly, Maria Riccio, Anna Mulrine, Sean Zeller, and Daniel Strauss to end. Damian.
Chairman, thanks so much. Can you tell us a little bit about your visit to Iraq? And you said you met with the Prime Minister. Were they was he acknowledging how bad the situation there was? Or, I mean, obviously they're very defensive about us potentially giving assistance to the Kurds, giving assistance to Sunni tribes. Yeah. Was he asking for more time? What was his response?
Well, he's a Shia. He asked the administration for more military assistance. In my judgment, was not given that, so he had an issue with that. He also, and our State Department, for that matter, when we were over there, were very much against the idea of bypassing Baghdad and funding or arming the Peshmerga and the Sunni tribes because they thought that goes around Baghdad and therefore undermines the central government, therefore undermines the unity of government, and therefore splits up partitions the three different Kurd, Shia, Sunni states, right? That was the State Department line, and that was the Prime Minister's line. Now, the Speaker, who's a Sunni, who's Speaker of the Parliament, you get a little different version of the story where they would like to see more direct funding. And when I've met with the Kurds and Peshmerga and the mayor of Mosul and the Kurdistan prime minister or president, they want, what they see is these weapons that we're sending going through Baghdad, not getting to the Peshmerga, to the Kurds, or to the Sunni tribes, but rather getting diverted to the Shia militias. And from their perspective, I don't know if it's accurate, but they see the prime minister as a proxy of the Shia militias. Shia militias are a proxy of Iran. And when you have these Shia militias, it's a fact, when they go into these Sunni communities, they completely inflame and disenfranchise the Sunni tribes, which was very contrary to what we did with the Sons of the Awakening, where we were able to bring these tribes over to fight al-Qaeda in Iraq. Right now, the strategy is not working that way. In fact, bringing in the Shia militias is in direct contradiction of that. And it's pushing them away. We had the Sunni sheikh just 2 days ago, the largest one, who was the biggest part of the Sons of the Awakening, say, with the Shias here, Shia militias, they're either staying out of the fight or they're going to join their Sunni brethren, ISIS. Right. I see that as a real political disaster. We talk about the military efforts, but there's a political, diplomatic piece to all this, and that's a failure of the administration. It's a failure of Iraq's leadership. And when I asked Jay Johnson that question, he's like, well, they don't have a choice.
So my question
it's the only fighting force that can defeat ISIS now.
Is the Prime Minister in denial about that, though? I mean,
he knows his own army is incapable now of defeating ISIS. Yeah. So he feels like he has to, out of necessity, he has to bring in the Shia militias to win, but they're not giving the Kurds and the Peshmerga, I think, they're not helping train and fortify them as much as they should. Because I think and this goes to, there's a greater issue here, and that is, what is the ground force eventually? I think our guys got to be embedded with the Iraqi National Army, but the Arab nations have a responsibility and a role. It's in their backyard. The Arab nations are never going to go into Syria and Iraq to fight ISIS as long as they know they're helping Assad in the process, right? So as long as Assad's sitting there, I mean, look at Yemen, right? So Saudi's got AQAP operating freely in Yemen. That's okay, right? Because they're Sunni. They're Al-Qaeda, but they're Sunni. Houthis come in, boom, Saudi wakes up, well, we got a problem all of a sudden. Same dynamic. So until we find a safe exile for Mr. Assad and can bring in a more stable form of government into Syria, I don't think we'll ever get the Arab League of Nations to actually put a ground force, which they could. Turkey, Egypt, Saudi could put a fighting force in there, a ground force, but they will never commit to that as long as they think that in any way, shape, or form they are helping Assad by taking ISIS out.
Paul Bedard, Washington Examiner.
Off topic, there's been a recent report and growing concern about terrorist threats to the electric grid, some legislation in the House talking about backing up the system with transformers, an expensive kind of process. Do you think the grid's is threatened in any way, and if so, what should be done?
Well, it's always vulnerable. Anything tied to the internet's vulnerable. The only way you can be completely safe is to disconnect yourself from the internet. And so cyber's an ever-evolving threat that we have to stay in front of to protect our critical infrastructure. So I think the legislation that I passed out of my committee that passed with 355 votes on the floor, again, this is another issue with the Senate. I mean, we had overwhelming bipartisan support. Privacy groups and security groups supported it. The president would sign it into law. And essentially what it does is we make Homeland the lead civilian portal to the private sector to share malicious code information. 80% of that's in the private sector, so they can share with the government, but also across private to private sector lines. Only through doing that can you patch your networks and have the keys to lock the door so they can't get in. And that's not happening right now. And particularly in the private sector, it's not happening. And so the companies I talk to want this, but the only way that they can make it happen is to provide liability protection. So they're not incentivized to share in the safe harbor, we call it, with the NKIC at DHS if they don't know that they be protected by a lawsuit for sharing that information. And so we provide that in the bill. It had broad-based support from the tech industry, from private sector as a whole, the Chamber of Commerce, but also the privacy groups like the civilian interface rather than NSA, the military interface. And we think it's the right place for this information sharing. DHS can't prosecute you, it can't spy on you. It's not like the FBI, it's not like NSA. It is the outreach to the state and local and private sector critical infrastructure. So we think we would go a long ways to helping protect our power grids. Our financial institutions are under attack from Iran every day. Russia and China are hitting us every day. The Anthem records, the Sony attack. I mean, it happens on a monthly basis. And cyber warfare is a serious concern of mine, that we can shut things down like the power grid if we can't stay ahead of the curve, and the intent's out there. And now even the cyber jihadists are trying to get this. They don't have the capability, but they sure as heck have the intent to want to do it. They just don't have the capability right now.
Aaron Kelly from USA Today.
Mr. Chairman, what's happening with your border security bill? Is that something that you want to see come to the floor soon?
Yeah, well, I still want it to go to the floor. The criticisms were that it didn't have interior enforcement. My committee was comprised of a political compromise 10 years ago, or after 9/11. So even though ICE is within DHS, Judiciary Committee has jurisdiction over that. So there were some criticisms. Well, it doesn't do anything about interior enforcement and this and that. Judiciary now has marked up and passed out their interior enforcement bills. And so Mr. Goodlatte and I have had these discussions, and we think now, with that piece done, and with the Homeland Approach bill out of the way, because that was creating some problems for us as well, the boogeyman, so to speak, is not in the room anymore. So, yeah, I think that it's time. I know one of the number one issues when I go home is when are you going to get that border secure? And they look at me as chairman of Homeland Security to get it done. And I think we owe it to the American people to get it done. So I see a ripe opportunity. I've talked to the speaker about it. I'm pushing leadership. I'm trying to galvanize members to get kind of a movement, if you will, to at least start the process where, we can, now that we have the interior enforcement, let's put the border security bill on the floor and the interior enforcement bills and get that passed out of the House.
We're going to go to Maria Riccio from McClatchy.
I was actually going to ask about border security, and some of you may know my home paper is actually the Fort Worth Star-Telegram. So, yeah, I know you know. So I have Texas questions. I just wanted to follow up on a little bit on border security to see what Senator Sessions, who was one of your problems last time on this, if he is in agreement. I know he's in the other chamber, but I mean, he presented the problem last time. And since this is my one shot, I want to ask you about the 5 Texans, we're counting 5, running for president, and if you're supporting any of them.
Are there 5 of them now?
We have 5.
If you count Rand Paul and Jeb Bush.
And Jeb Bush, native Texan.
Yeah.
And Carly Fiorina, native Texan.
Oh, I didn't do it. Carly. Well, I'll take the first question first.
There are actually some people who count Santorum because Santorum works in near the airport, near DFW. He runs the Christian movie studio or something.
3 Texas congressmen
They've
today
been to Texas,
are
are they
endorsing Ted
candidates?
Cruz.
Who?
Ratcliffe, Gomert, and
Culberson.
Culberson.
Yeah, well, Culberson did.
Maybe not Ratcliffe.
I'm feeling left out.
Well, okay. So first one is what, border security? Or no? Oh, I'm sorry, yeah. Look, I sat down with him in good faith and explained to him I didn't have jurisdiction over it wasn't what was in my bill, it was what wasn't in my bill that he had the issues with. And I explained to him what wasn't in my bill was within judiciary's jurisdiction. I had explained jurisdiction to him. And, I hope he understands that now. And now, with Goodlatte's bills out there, I would think that would resolve the issues that he had with the bill. But I know that there's a growing movement. People want this done. They just want it done. And every day I've got members on the floor coming up to me saying, when are you gonna get that bill on the floor? And it's not easy. You'd think it would be a very easy thing to do. But people raise all sorts of issues about it. Well, it's a first step then, or this and that. But under these theories, you can never pass a border security bill. So my concern, it's not an immigration bill. My bill is a security bill, first and foremost, to protect Americans from the threats that I see. And that's why I've always been adamant about it. Even back when I was a counterterrorism prosecutor, I had the Texas-Mexico border in my jurisdiction, even back then. And I saw, potential threats. Well, terrorist, is always on the radar. We're always worried about that. But, you got a lot of bad elements coming in, drug cartels, MS-13, a lot of bad actors. And the people down there are crossing, not the people just coming to work anymore. They're a little more on the violent side, from what the ranchers tell me down there. The presidential race, I think it's way too early. We don't know who's going to be in the race. I'll tell you what I would like to see in our nominee is someone who can unite our party and not divide it. I think a lot of us are tired of this division going on. I like more of a Reagan type person who can bring the party together and the country and not be a polarizing, divisive figure. And I think that I would also like to see someone that has some experience. And I'm not going to go through the litany of names, but somebody's got some experience in what I consider to be the number one issue of the day, and that's our national security and foreign policy. And I think that is going to be the issue that's going to be front and center against Hillary Clinton, who's going to basically tout her credentials as the foreign policy expert. And if we don't have a guy that's nominated who's got little of no experience in foreign policy or national security, how can we possibly take her on with any credibility?
Anna Mulrine from the Monitor.
You've spoken about the need for more aggressive strategy in Iraq and perhaps more troops, more even forward operating bases near the Syrian border so we can send troops into Syria. And so you've become a student of this war, given your expertise on the committee. And so, I'd love for you to paint a picture of that. I mean, we've been at this war for 10 years. Should it be another 10 years? Should it be just as long as it takes to get this done because it's such a priority? How much, as the Pentagon likes to say, blood and treasure is worth expending? And then I'd also like to ask you about the Jade Helm exercise and whether you were worried. Exercise Jade Helm. It was last month where these National Guard troops.
Texas, right?
Yes, yeah. The governor was worried about those troops. So I was wondering if you were worried too.
Yeah. I was kind of hoping that wouldn't come up. No, I mean, it's a great question. I think people are war fatigued. I think there was an isolationist movement, even in my party, prior to ISIS cutting heads off. I mean, if they hadn't beheaded the journalist, American journalist, and woken up the American people, I'm not sure the American people would even be paying attention. But I think that's their own demise. I mean, it's hard to sit back and watch an evil force like that grow that are intent on killing Jews, Christians, the West, Americans, cutting heads off, lighting Jordanian pilots on fire. That type of barbarism and the potential for external plots can't be left to fester on its own without us being involved. I'm not an isolationist. I think every time we've done that as a nation, we've gotten into trouble. And World War II is a good example. I think Churchill was right and Chamberlain was wrong. We had a policy of appeasement. Weakness invites aggression, whether it's Putin as well in Ukraine. And look, I think it's a mess. And I wish the problem would go away. And the question's asked, well, would you have done anything differently had you known today what you knew, or known back then what you knew today? And I think the right question is, would you have pulled out precipitously and not negotiated a status of forces agreement if you knew then what you know today? And that being that by doing that, and remember we had status of forces agreements in Germany, Japan, had them in Korea after our conflicts there, and the idea that we didn't have that in Iraq was, I think, irresponsible. And so I would answer that question that, we should not have done that. Had we had a residual force in Iraq, I don't think we'd be talking about this. And we wouldn't be dealing with the threat of ISIS that we are today. We beat al-Qaeda in Iraq. And all the constituents of mine whose sons died over there, and we beat them. And we left a stable country, and then it became destabilized because of the lack of engagement by withdrawing completely, by not engaging Maliki. Mrs. Clinton went to Baghdad one time in her tenure as Secretary of State for 3 hours in Baghdad. That shows you the level of disengagement in Iraq, and that, I think, created ISIS. So,
back there, do you think we should stay there another 10 years? Is ISIS such a threat that we should just stay there as long as it takes?
Well, I think just like they're not some monolithic giant that we can't beat. I think sometimes people, although they took over Ramadi, pretty scary, in Mosul, it's because the Iraqi National Army is so incapable. I think if we came up with a military strategy and political one that was aggressive and serious about destroying and defeating them, not containing them, that we could do this in short order. We did it with al-Qaeda in Iraq. We can do it again with ISIS. It's very similar to what we saw with al-Qaeda in Iraq, and then leave a more stable. The problem is the destabilization of that region, not only in the Middle East, but also in northern Africa as well. And then countries like Saudi, they don't understand our foreign policy anymore. There's a lot of uncertainty. Why are you negotiating with Iran? Why are you letting the Muslim Brotherhood take over Egypt when I was in Saudi? They think it's me. I guess that's my decision, and it's not. But there's no certainty in foreign policy, and with that, there's a lot of confusion. There's a lot of destabilization going on, and when you have failed states that destabilize, that become power vacuums, just like pre-9/11 in Afghanistan with bin Laden, you got a problem. And I agree. That's going to be the great national debate, I think, probably in the 2016 election, is how engaged do we really want to be over there. But I do think most Americans see ISIS for what it is. It's one of the most evil forms of barbarism that we've seen in our lifetime.
Mr. Zeller, I'm sorry.
Really quickly, were you worried about that at all? Did you talk to the Pentagon?
I'm a big supporter of our United States military.
What does that mean? I was going to ask Jake anyway. What does that mean? I'm a big supporter of that military.
Well, I don't. Our United States military is not our threat. ISIS is our threat.
Sean.
And Iran is our threat.
Sean Zeller from CQ.
USA Freedom, Congressman. Senator Cornyn, your former colleague, proposed a deal basically where the USA Freedom would be the base of it, but it would be transitioned more slowly. So the phone companies the data would go back to the phone companies more slowly, not over 6 months, but maybe over 2 years. And there would be safeguards built in to ensure that that's working.
Yeah.
That the law enforcement can still get that data quickly. And perhaps some requirement that the phone companies hold on to the data for a certain period of time. It sounded like pretty reasonable offer given their senators' prior positions. Do you think that's a reasonable offer, and do you think that a deal can be reached around that fairly quickly so that if there is any expiration, it's very short-lived?
Yeah, I think, I worked for John for 4 years as his deputy attorney general, and he's always a very thoughtful, rational thinker in the room, more adult in the room, and I think that proposal is very sound. I mean, I think part of the concern I've heard is that, you're not given enough time to make that transition, and then the retention time, for the records. And I think that's a kind of creative proposal that I think could hopefully bring House and Senate together. I just don't know what's going to happen with this filibuster, but that's an idea that I would support in the House.
Mr. Strauss, talking points memo.
Excuse me for interrupting earlier, Mr. Chairman. So I wanted to ask you, since we've done JTOWN, Jeb Bush, and this, all the attention last week to whether we should have gone into Iraq or not again. I mean, you talked about being interested in someone who, or supporting a candidate who would show foreign policy leadership. Was the former governor's responses a sign of political acumen on foreign policy? What did you think of that? And would you have, what would your answer have been to the question, if we know now what we didn't know at the time, would you have authorized another invasion of Iraq?
Well, you'd think he would be prepared for that question. But I would have answered it differently. That when I got elected, we were already in, and my goal was to make sure that we stabilized and won, and then and responsibly got out and left the residual force. And so, mistakes have been made all throughout that conflict. I mean, Condi Rice admitted that the post-invasion of Iraq was not handled well. I mean, Bremer, I think, made a lot of mistakes. The de-Baathification was a huge mistake. They all these Baathists went and joined Al Qaeda in Iraq and Zarqawi because they were thrown out on the streets. And so that created a whole other wave of terrorists, and some of whom we're still dealing with today in the ISIS organization.
You said you would have answered the question differently. How would you have answered that question?
I think the question is, you can't change the past. You can try to learn from the past, but you can't change what happened. The question is how you deal with Iraq in the present. And yeah, I mean, I would have left that. I would have had a status of forces agreement. That was a mistake too. We had bad intelligence. That was a mistake as well. But dealing with it today, how are you going to stabilize that region again? Can we afford to leave it destabilized? can we allow ISIS to flourish and govern and then conduct external operations like they're doing right now against the United States? It's going to take one big attack, and people are going to say, geez, what were you doing in the Congress to stop that? Oh, I just allowed this safe haven to flourish over there. So how do you deal with it in the present? And I think there are a series of things that we could be doing tactically but we're not being aggressive. Whether it's airstrikes where we got zero collateral damage, whether it's embedding special operations with the Iraqi army training, arming the Peshmerga, trying to get the Arab League of Nations involved, trying to get Assad exiled out so we can have galvanize this force against ISIS that we know it's in their backyard. The Saudis don't like ISIS, but they're Sunni. Now we know that Qatar and Kuwait are funding a lot of their operations. That's a weird phenomenon at the Gulf states. A lot of the money comes out of there, and that's a whole other issue.
We've got about 3 minutes left. Sarah Sorcher from the Monitor.
Thanks. I just wanted to ask you about, there was a letter this week from major companies, including Apple, Google, Cisco, protesting against some of the recent demands floated by officials about encrypting or finding backdoors or other ways to access encrypted data. You have FBI Director Comey yesterday saying this makes him depressed. Where do you stand on this issue, and where do you think that Congress will ultimately go?
Yeah, that's a great. It's called dark space. It's what I referenced to earlier. It's a tricky issue, and it's controversial on some levels. It's controversial when you talk about iPhones and encryption and the inability to backdoor into that. Where I don't think it's controversial are the platforms that the terrorists use to communicate in dark space. And that is primarily these platform servers, again, where they say, let's go. I've seen the communications between the terrorists and who they're trying to radicalize in the United States. And what they say is, let's go into DM. And that's the message box. And then they go into that box. Now those communications, if we don't have coverage, we lose that content, that communication. But if we do have coverage, in many cases we do, if there's a FISA up, that's fine, but they're smart. And they realize if they start communicating there, but then they will jump out of that into another platform. A lot of these mom and pop shops out of Colorado that have these platforms that we can't get access to, and that's what's called dark space. So they can communicate freely in what's called secure comm and launch their directives to launch an attack against the United States. And there's no way our law enforcement and intelligence community is completely incapable of picking up those communications. That's a threat. The foreign fighter is a threat, but I would argue that threat is one of the biggest threats to the homeland. And it's one that needs to be fixed. And the only way it can be fixed is legislatively.
Well, thank you for doing this. We appreciate it. We hope you'll come back.
Yeah, well, I appreciate your time. Thanks for having me. Thank you.